But one year I had been in Guatemala, and you know how sometimes when you're talking to somebody about business or whatever, but suddenly you get a sense, this person I think is a homeschooler. But I'm like, do you homeschool? And he goes, oh yeah. And he said it was really big in his church. So I told him about the Compassion Fund. And then later that year, I heard at Christmas time we'd given a gift to a widowed woman in Guatemala who was about to be kicked out of her house. And I have no idea if it was connected to my conversation or not, but the Lord does work in some pretty wonderful ways.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks, where I get to talk to interesting people about things involving homeschooling. Today, we're in Asheville, North Carolina, for the HSLDA National Leaders Conference, and so I've been grabbing up some people and having good conversations with them, and my next guest is Hellman, who has long been a member of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association board, and recently just announced that he was going to be resigning from that position to pursue another very important mission that's really big in his life and on his heart. And today we'd just like to talk to Rogers about his long career of homeschooling with his wife Mary, as well as his involvement in the greater homeschooling movement and in the medical missionary field. Welcome, Rogers.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be here.
So you're married to Mary.
Correct.
And you and I met for the first time shortly after I came to work for HSLDA over 20 years ago.
I remember that.
And we attended the same church at the time, and I think you were just about to or had only recently left your previous career with AOL. Is that right?
That could be right. My memory is getting fuzzy.
Well, whether that's when we met or not, you had a long career with AOL, and you left that all behind to do what?
I left it all behind primarily because my two daughters I could see were about to leave home, and I had been a working father all this time and didn't have the time with them. And so I just wanted to be with them for a couple of years. That was the plan. When those couple of years were over, because I had been a VP with a major company and the tech sector, which is what I do, was down, I kept hearing I was overqualified. And then along came the next adventure.
So when I met you, you were part of my local homeschooling community. Tell us, how did you and Mary get involved in homeschooling, and what was your homeschool adventure like?
Well, like a lot of people that started homeschooling when we did, we heard Dr. Raymond Moore on Focus on the Family. And while our kids were too young to start homeschooling, we lived in Amarillo, Texas at the time. And we found a local group of homeschoolers meeting and went to that and started talking to the kids, and noticed the kids were just super comfortable talking to adults, and they were different and impressive, and we're like, okay, well, we're in. So from Amarillo, we moved to Estes Park, worked for a company in Boulder, Colorado. But that company was going down, and I had a job offer in Switzerland. Plus, the mountains in Colorado just didn't compare. So we went to Switzerland for a while. And that's when our girls turned old enough to homeschool, and we were the first people to homeschool at least in Bern, Switzerland.
So there wasn't a Swiss Homeschool Legal Defense Association. What was it like for you trying to homeschool in Switzerland?
Well, it was actually very easy because we had just immigrated. The laws required them. We lived in a very, very small town. And Switzerland in small towns is very provincial, but the law required them to provide English-speaking teachers to our daughters if we went to school. And they couldn't do that. So they were very happy to hear that we didn't want them to go to school. So that was what happened. And Mary never learned German, but she would get phone calls from Swiss people wanting to ask about homeschooling, and she couldn't say. So I was spending a lot of times in the evenings explaining things to strangers who called.
How long were you there in Switzerland?
I did just a year.
Just a year. And then where?
From Switzerland, I took a job in upstate New York, being a contractor for IBM, basically I've been kind of on the move.
So your homeschooling occurred not just multinationally, but in a number of different states. But you eventually ended up in Virginia.
That's right. I had I did a work in. Lived in Austin, Texas, which is where Mary and I are from, but ended up taking a contract position in Des Moines, Iowa. So I flew home on weekends and would be in Des Moines during the week. It was a job where it was very contentious. There were about 120 people working on this project, and I was just one of many, but I knew a number of the other contractors that were there. But the managers and bosses were arguing and yelling and even shoving and pushing a lot when that started. And I came to find out that this was the second attempt to write the software. And during the first attempt, one of the contractors had been murdered. So it was pretty bad. But because I knew some of the other workers, I learned what the problems were. And I stayed up all night one night writing software that solved the problem. And all of a sudden, they threw out all the other managers and put me in. And that's how I got a reputation of solving problems and was invited to be in charge of a software development firm in Manhattan. And suddenly on the East Coast, everybody thought I was great. So that led to an opportunity with AOL. So.
Well, when did you first get involved with Homeschool Legal Defense Association?
We became members early on. Even before our kids were homeschooled, we started. We were members. I just thought it was important to contribute to the overall growth of the movement, and certainly didn't feel threatened in Switzerland either. But we just wanted to be part of a community.
And when you moved to Virginia, I think you might have met Mike Ferris at some point.
Yes, met Mike. Asked a question in a Sunday school class. It was the second time I had been in a group where Mike posed a question. I suspect not thinking anybody knew the answer, and both times I think I surprised him. So, and we became friends, and just life in Purcellville, as you might call it.
Now, I've known you for a long time, and most of that time you've had a more formal relationship with HSLDA. And just as a little background, years ago, there was HSLDA and then a separate organization called the Homeschool Foundation. And I think you were instrumental in kind of getting the Homeschool Foundation off the ground. Can you tell us about that?
I can. A little bit of background. I remember I was pushing 6 years old. My father was military, and we had just moved to yet another place, and I was in charge of my two younger brothers. I remember my youngest brother still in diapers. We were in a playground, and I looked up, and on the slide was a blonde-headed girl, apparently afraid of the heights because she was crying. And I started crying. I didn't know why. I didn't understand this at all. And I asked my parents about it, and they're like, "Oh, that's empathy. That's good." So I've never shied away from empathy because of that. But while in New York, I had heard about a homeschooling family whose father had died. And I was praying like crazy. I had no idea who the lady was. I didn't know her. I just hurt for them. And it was like, what should I do? No answers came. But it bothered me for a long time that there was nothing that I knew that I could do to help. But I eventually forgot about it. But while living in Purcellville and while being with AOL and making pretty good money, I heard another story of another family. And same thing, I started praying, what can I do? And I didn't know. But I grabbed Mike Ferris and said, here's a check, figure out something that we can do. and he was like, well, what do you want to do? I'm like, I don't know. Let's try to do something that perpetuates it, though. And he put me in touch with Zan. Zan and I talked. She's like, what should we do? And I'm like, I don't know.
That's Zan Tyler, the legendary homeschool pioneer from South Carolina.
Exactly. And the first time I talked to her, Dynamo, we're good friends now, of course. But I really didn't have, and the next thing I heard was months later, I heard that Mike Smith was in a conference talking about me and that HSLDA had created the Widows Fund or a Compassion Fund. I didn't do anything other than care about people. I didn't, and it was all HSLDA.
Well, and I know, from my early days of association with HSLDA and with you, you have, and I don't want to embarrass you, but you have been kind of legendary actually in just that heart of compassion that you've always had that really spurred the rest of us on to try to do likewise. So thank you for that. And, from that small beginning, our compassion program has given, I think Chuck said the other day, he's the guy that sort of ran the thing, helped create the thing, over $15 million to homeschoolers who are struggling through hard times. So that small beginning led to a big thing, Rogers, and so thank you.
I've been thinking about it, and Chris this morning, and he said, today, if you hear the voice of the Lord, harden not your heart. And that is so important. And, I respond to people. I read people pretty well, body language. And, and the Lord has made me keenly aware, not just when I accepted him as my Savior, but even, I'm messed up. I see other people messed up, and I give them, I try to give myself the same grace I give others, and it's like we're all struggling, but that's okay. We've got a role to do, and we've got things that we need to do, and loving one another and serving one another is way up there on the list.
Yeah. So we showed at the conference here a video of just a few examples of the lives that were touched just this last year by the Compassion Fund. Most of them were responding to kind of a surprise Christmas gift that we were able to give to single parents and people who had lost their jobs or disaster victims, things like that. Kind of one of the most moving things that we do at this conference.
Yeah, I love it. And I don't see enough of those videos. But one year, I had been in Guatemala. And you know how sometimes when you're talking to somebody about business or whatever, but suddenly you get a sense, this person, I think, is a homeschooler. I was talking to a Guatemalan gentleman, and it was all pure business. But I'm like, do you homeschool? And he goes, oh, yeah. And so I told him about the compassion. And he said his church, it was really big in his church. So I told him about the Compassion Fund. And then later that year, I heard at Christmas time, we'd given a gift to a widowed woman in Guatemala who was about to be kicked out of her house because she didn't have the funds to pay rent. And we sent a check to her, and she had responded back. And I have no idea if it was connected to my conversation or not, but, the Lord does work in some pretty wonderful ways.
So eventually, because you were instrumental in kind of founding this whole concept that we have, you came onto the board, and We did some reorganizing, so the foundation kind of merged into Homeschool Legal Defense proper, and you came over onto the HSLDA board like in 2017 when we did the merger. Yes. And you've served faithfully and diligently on the board now for many years, since before our merger even. And now the Lord's calling you to something else. Tell us about that.
Well, during the 2 years I had taken off from the workforce and then found it a little challenging to get back in, there's no worries financially. So for some reason or other, my wife and I found ourselves in Guatemala. We were working with a group of doctors from Canada, and we were just going around helping. And I observed during those 2 weeks that doctors think one way and engineers think another. And they're very different. And they were doing things that just made me want to pull my hair out. There were several things that fell into that category. But the major thing was they would go to a patient and they were having to go through a translator, and they would say, "Are you allergic to any medications?" And the patient would say, because we're in rural parts of Guatemala where older people are uneducated and illiterate. Younger people can read, but almost nobody is medically literate. So they would say, "Are you allergic to any medications?" And the answer would often be something like, "Yes, I'm allergic to red pills," or "I'm allergic to blue pills." So getting useful information was really hard fought. And sometimes we even had to go through 3 languages because Guatemala has, I think, 32 different dialects. And then write it down on paper, and then that information would be lost because in that village there would be 30 other women with the same name. And there's no addresses, no social security numbers. And so all that work was useful for now, but then lost. And I'm like, if we create a computerized system and we identify patients biometrically and it translates between languages, and I started thinking all these things, and I'm like, I feel like I should do this. And I told my wife, I was like, it'll take 2, maybe 3 years, but I'm going to set it aside and do that. And I saw 4 major things that needed to be done. And it's like, this is going to be a challenge, but I can do it. And put it in some clinics in Guatemala and discovered that I had only seen half the problems. And it took years of trial and error. But also my goal it grew to be that, if I can get lots of clinics and I get all their information into one place, I can do analytics. And I will be able to then say, this region of Guatemala, there's 6 regions that have problems with the drinking water. You can determine things, and you start being strategic about healthcare. I can see when a new highly contagious disease is seeping up through the population. And traditionally, that's where pandemics originate, is in rural settings, developing countries, because that's the nexus of people to animals. So I just saw this as being so powerful. I did not see it being so complicated and hard. I have been on the verge of tears many times.
And this sort of became your life's work, really, right?
Yeah. Yes, it did.
And that's now many years.
That's many years. And the biggest challenge that I ever encountered, I thought that I had finally wrapped up all the really challenging aspects and was invited to Tanzania by a group. They took me around to lots and lots of clinics. And almost all of them said, we've got to have this. But also almost all of them said, but we need you to make some changes. And they were all different changes. You can't do that with software. You may be able to manage 1 or 2 variations, but you can't do 20 variations. It gets out of control. So I came back to the United States, at first really excited because it was so popular, and then really bummed out because it was so impossible. And so doing what bummed people do, I became depressed. I'm like, Lord, why did you call me to do something and it's impossible? It was a very natural reaction, and also a very natural reaction when you're depressed is to take a nap. So I was doing that and had this dream that woke me up, and it's this image, and I just don't deal in images. My brain never works that way. But the image kind of suggested a solution. But sadly, my reaction was, that's interesting, but I don't care anymore. But then what happened is, for the next few weeks, I was waking, sleeping, images were popping into my head. And I finally relented and said, okay, I'll go give it a try, Lord. And so put those ideas just to a proof of concept, and it worked. And that allows me now to completely customize all the clinics, usually in a matter of minutes. The architecture supports hospitals. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I see it as world changing, and
you're in demand kind of all over the world right now.
Yeah, I just heard some other country was asking me for help just the other day. I'm trying to remember who.
You came back from Uganda recently.
Yes.
I guess you've been to Africa several times now.
Twice.
Okay. Tanzania and Uganda.
Yeah.
So in addition to being on the board of HSLDA and working with our compassion work, you have actually been called on to change the course of history in Panama. Tell us about that.
Well, with my medical work, I get myself into trouble sometimes. And one of those times was I was in a van full of UVA professors, or actually deans. We'd been at the top of a mountain, and we were coming down, and the brakes went out. And we're talking mountains in Guatemala, not mountains in Colorado. So what ensued was pretty much like you'd see in movies, where the van's slamming around and up against the sides. But as soon as I was in the back, I had the window down, and I noticed we were going faster. And then I noticed the smell of brakes. And I put my hands up, and all of a sudden, the Holy Spirit just spoke to me and just said, no worries, this is just going to be another adventure in Guatemala. And so I put my hands back down because I just believed it. Well, I thought, I should actually put my hands up. But I was in complete peace and total control as this van careened down the mountain, brushed against the sides, and finally didn't make this curb, broke a wheel off, and had the bumper hanging over the precipice, just like in the movies. I say all that because I tend to be unflappable, but this was something that had me really scared. My wife and I were in Panama on vacation, and Mike Donnelly contacted us and said, there's a politician in Panama that's proposing a homeschool law. Would I go talk to her? I didn't want to. I tried to get out of it, but they wouldn't hear from me. I've got beach clothes on. And so they bought attire from Panamanian attire that I didn't know how to wear. I felt pretty ridiculous. They picked me up, took me to the government building, which didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me is they led me into a large auditorium. And there were people, spectators gathering in the back. There were 2 large TV cameras, about 20 journalists taking pictures, and a translator asked me what I was going to say to Parliament. And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm going to say. I didn't know this was going to happen. And I really was scared. I just, suddenly finding yourself thrust in and expected to address a parliament in another country is not an everyday occurrence. But the translator said, just think about what I'm going to say. And of course, talking about homeschooling and its advantages comes real natural. I could do that very easily. It's just when you're speaking before a group, you want to have a good opening and a good closing. And I had none of that. But I told her what I was going to say, and she felt good. And I was starting to feel like, okay, I can do this. But then I looked up and I saw monitors on the wall, and I realized this was being televised nationally, live. So I started to lose it again, but it was my turn. And I think I did an okay with an opening. I was muddling somewhat. Gave the outline of why homeschooling is good, why it works, and how we know it works. Got to the part where the closing, or I had nothing else to say, and I'm just opening my mouth and talking and hearing what I'm saying at the same time everybody else did. And I said, homeschooling makes strong families. Homeschooling makes strong students. Homeschooling makes strong families. And strong families make a strong nation, which was the perfect thing to say because everybody just went nuts over it. And yes, the Lord came through. He is gracious.
So if you had known that you were actually going to be addressing a country's parliament before you arrived there, would you have done it?
No, no.
So there's a reason you didn't know.
Yeah, I've actually been through more terrifying things than just the ride down. This was the most afraid I've ever been. I used to do a lot of cave exploring, so I don't get lost easy. I was lost in that building, but I looked out the door thinking about bolting and just didn't know how to get out of the building, so I stayed put.
And that was just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it was just a few years ago.
Wow. Great story. So while it saddens us to see you depart the board, and I know we'll stay friends, and you'll always be a great supporter of the work of HSLDA and the larger homeschooling community, we're very excited for this new stage of your career where you made a major breakthrough and are in demand all over the world to do really a great new work. So thank you for your many years of service to HSLDA.
It was an honor. It really was.
Well, it's been an honor and a privilege for me to know you and to work with you all these years, and your lovely wife, Mary, who Debbie just thinks the world of as well. So, Rogers, I'm going to give you the final word. What would you have to say to an audience that's interested in homeschooling and as your many, many years of involvement, both as a homeschool dad and a compassionate homeschool leader? And one of the things that I know you're also passionate about is reaching out in the homeschooling world to communities that perhaps haven't heard the good news of homeschooling. What would you have to say?
What's universal is that parents love their children. I don't care if we're talking about Americans, we're talking about Black Americans, or Latinos, or Europeans, or even Arabs or Israelis. They all love their children, and all children are different. That's just kind of universally known and understood. So homeschooling, once they know that they can do it, it has an appeal. But the homeschoolers now, and the homeschoolers from certainly when we started, are the sort of people that will do things that are different. They don't always go with the flow. And that is the group that will make fundamental changes to society. They're willing to not just follow along. And they need to be encouraged. They need to be loved and accepted. They also need to work together. But this movement is strong. It's going to get stronger, and it's going to impact the world in ways that we sit back and take notice and cheer.
Wow. Well, thank you, Rogers. Thanks for joining us today. Once again, Jim Mason from Asheville, North Carolina at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association National Conference. It's been my pleasure to work many years with Rogers and to get to know he and his wife. And we'll be putting some updates about his work into our various communications as time goes on. Thank you for joining us. You can find out more about Homeschool Legal Defense Association at our website at hslda.org. If you're not already a member, please consider joining to support the cause, as Rogers talked about earlier. And if you'd like to donate to our cause, you can do that as well. Many have been helped through our Compassion Fund over these years, and you can be a part of that too. So thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
Today's episode is made possible by HSLDA's Compassion Grants program. Whether it's a low-income family trying to make ends meet or a family suffering after a natural disaster, some families simply wouldn't have the resources to homeschool without the help of fellow homeschoolers like you. Our Compassion Grants exist to make this support possible. To learn more about how you can help make homeschooling possible for struggling families, or to request assistance if you are homeschooling through hard times, visit hslda.org/compassion. That's hslda.org/compassion. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.